Fantastic. Thanks so much. I am going to share my slides and I am going to jump right in with a story to make things concrete off the bat. This is a story about a young learner that one of our postdocs, or she was a postdoc at the time, Crystal Martin, was doing on fans who were engaged in the professional wrestling fandom online and writing around the fandom online as part of our Connected Learning Research Network work. And Maria was 17 when she was interviewed, and she was a big fan of professional wrestling. And she had originally gotten introduced to wrestling through a family connection. But then she discovered when she sort of revealed her interest in wrestling to her peers at school, they would tease her. It wasn't considered a really cool interest to have, so not something that she was really out about in her school context. So she went online to find other fans, and she got very involved in one of these role-playing boards where young people are writing stories collaboratively and interactively with each other about their fandom and their interest in particular heroes in the fandom. And she really got interested in writing through this engagement within the online fandom of professional wrestling. Now, in Maria's case, even though her friends were teasing her about her wrestling interests, she had a teacher who was very supportive and who she had a close and caring relationship with. And she confided in her about this writing that she was doing as part of her fandom. And that relationship to the teacher and that connection where she felt safe sharing her interests, which were stigmatized in the school context, really opened up a new set of opportunities for her. The teacher encouraged her to start writing for the school newspaper, and eventually that became a springboard for her to consider writing as a professional pathway. She still wanted to do her fandom writing for fun off in the side, but she ended up going to college where she could pursue technical writing as a potential career pathway. So what we see in Maria's case, where she started with a passionate interest that was supported not by her school relationships, but by a set of networked online relationships that supported not only her interest in the popular culture part of her interest, but also developing new interests around writing. And then the important part of the equation is that it didn't stay just in the kid-driven online interest space, because she had a relationship to a caring adult in school who opened up and brokered opportunities for her. She was able to connect those interests, the skills developed within her peer context, into opportunities that helped her find a place in the world and connected to academic opportunities. So in a nutshell, this is what we call connected learning, when young people are able to pursue something that they're genuinely invested in and passionate about with peers and caring adults who share that interest, whether that's in a physical community or in an online community, and that those interests and that skill development is tied to opportunities in academic development and career development or in civic engagement. So the moral of the story is that technology does open up new opportunities for connected learning, especially with the growth of online affinity networks and the ability to find a lot of specialized information online. But the maybe more important conclusion we can draw from this is that most young people are actually not finding those opportunities to connect the interests they're developing in their out of school time to interests and career development that are related to school. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of an echo. I don't know if that's just me, but so when we talk to young people, and we do, our research network has done a lot of research that really starts with young people and their interests and look at how it's supported through different aspects of their environment. And we usually find that the interest-driven learning, whether it's arts or performance or math or whatever kids might be interested in, is often supported, requires sort of caring adults and relatives in the home to scaffold a lot of those interests. And they're usually happening within home and community contexts with few connections to school. And part of, the broader reason for this is in the school side, we often think of, our role as moving young people through this pipeline where we're trying to, scaffold these transitions through these different institutions, adult-driven institutions, eventually to college and hopefully to career contexts. But when we do our research from a more youth-centered perspective, we find that young people, indeed, that formal pipeline is incredibly important for opportunity, but there's also an incredible web of supports in the out-of-school space and online communities and families, especially when young people are pursuing sort of a new kind of high-tech career that requires a lot of connections and social capital. Like in the tech field or in the creative fields, that there's often this whole web of connections, and the informal connections and the online and out of school connections are often the contexts that are kind of resilient even as young people make transitions through the formal pipeline, because those relationships between these big institutional transitions, often young people lose those relationships. Those relationships can be more brittle than some of the community-based or home-based relationships that they have. So this whole issue of, the tension between in school and out of school and interest-driven learning and academic learning, this is not a new dynamic, but it's really being exacerbated more with the advent of digital technologies, because young people have the ability to go online, pursue interests, and a much more diverse array of interest areas, to find communities where they can connect with others with those interests. So that kind of demand-driven, interest-driven learning that young people are doing out of school has just gained superpowers with the digital world. And that creates a tension between in-school and out-of-school learning, but that also creates, we believe in the connected learning world, a huge opportunity to connect between those two domains of learning. When we talk to young people, and this is more research on fan fiction writing and young people who are going online around popular culture, shared interests, we find that just like the case with Maria, a lot of young people are discovering interests in things like writing or science or math through these kind of pop culture or interest-driven engagements online. And because it's tied to a domain that they feel a lot of genuine investment and enthusiasm, it really propels their engagement in some of these new areas that are really relevant for their academic success as well. I think the tragic part about what we see is that a lot of times young people really firewall what they're doing in their interest-driven space and their online space with what they'll share with their teachers or even their parents. So this is an example from a study of Wattpad, which is like a big fan fiction writing site. And, a lot of the young people that, this was a study done by Ksenia Korobkovka, she around One Direction fandom, if you remember that band that was big for a while. And the middle schoolers who are engaged in that, is that partially, like, one of the things that gets the most eye rolls, like in grown-up context, is actually girl fandoms around boy bands and things like that. So they didn't feel safe or comfortable sharing about their fandom or about the fact that they might be writing hundreds of pages and reading like hundreds of pages of fan fiction online, but none of that is visible within the school context, because they don't feel like they would be understood, that they feel like they would be judged. And often we would interview these young people who are like highly engaged writers online, and we would ask them if they were readers, if they were writers, and they're like, no, I'm not a writer. That's what you do in school. So there was this big disconnect between the activities that these young people were pursuing in their interest-driven world and what they saw happening in school. Now, this disconnect becomes even more important because we're seeing a growing gap, and we're waiting for more recent numbers to come out. With the pandemic, I'm sure these numbers have changed as well, where wealthier families are investing more and more in this out of school and interest-driven space, whether it's in the arts or in tech camps or whatever it might be, where poorer families, they recognize the importance of this kind of interest-driven learning where young people are really, learning to make a genuine contribution, to be recognized for their performances and to connect with caring adults and mentors in an area of interest. But that gap has been widening over the past few decades. And that's happening in tandem with a decreased investment in the in-school space for extracurriculars. So if you put those graphs together, there's even more significant gap between the haves and have-nots in terms of interest-driven enrichment. So it's really, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to y'all because I think that you hold the keys to the kingdom in a lot of ways with connected learning. We look at both in-school and out-of-school learning, but there's so much power when what kids are doing in their interest-driven lives can connect to what's happening in school. And I'll just give an example. Maria's example was about an individual educator and a relationship that scaffolded the connection. I want to offer an example of sort of a more intentional school level design that scaffolds the connection between out of school gaming interests in this case and in-school activities. So this is a case that comes from a school in New York City called Quest to Learn, which was intentionally designed around a game-based pedagogy and actively embracing game-based learning within the school context. So Tal, 11 years old at the time that we learned about her interest in Minecraft, and she was a student at the Quest to Learn school. And like Maria, her initial interest was cultivated within the home context. She was playing Minecraft with her cousin, and then she went to the school and said, we want to start a Minecraft club at school. And the school said, okay, and sponsored that club for them. And then she, again, in the out of school context, she was avidly watching Minecraft videos on YouTube and decided that she wanted to bring that as an activity to the club. Again, because this was a school that was actively invested in supporting game-based learning, they not only embraced, the YouTube production around Minecraft, but they also featured the work in the school newspaper. And, that sponsorship eventually led to Tal starting to, work more on writing scripts and doing creative production within the school context. So again, this is another example of a connected learning cycle being supported by an educator within a school context with really pretty significant sort of learning and identity outcomes for the young person involved. Okay, so those are a few examples, stories of connected learning in action. I think the important thing about connected learning is it's not just a description for a type of learning that we believe is really important. And it's not that all learning has to be connected learning all the time, but we do find that, we feel like all young people deserve to have the experience of connected learning when they're really being supported for the things that they're authentically invested in and care about. But we understand that kids need to be able to just pursue their interest just for fun without it being school connected. They need to be able to mess around with their friends. And they need to learn and do school stuff that isn't necessarily connected with their interests. But we believe that there's a set of design principles that can support this kind of learning in a way that's connected to school. It's not that the school shoulders the entire burden of the connected learning ecosystem, but the ability to connect learning from in and out of from informal to formal contexts is where there's a lot of power in this model. And I'll walk through the design principles just through one example of a program that we have had a research partnership for a while. A lot of these design principles are fairly, they're not going to be surprising, but maybe some of these examples are ones that, they're fairly new to the ecosystem because they're leveraging new emergent digital interests. So the example I'll share, let me see how I'm doing on time. Okay, I'll move quickly through these last examples, is Scholastic Esports. And we've had a partnership with the North American Scholastic Esports Federation for a while. You probably know about esports, which is competitive gaming, which has become, bigger than most, traditional athletics, but a lot of schools are starting to incorporate esports teams within their college and high school and even middle school programs. I think programs like NASEP are unique in a lot of ways. The part that, for all esports programs that are sponsored within the school, it is a that just the fact of sponsoring gaming in an official way and celebrating within the school context is a really big deal for a lot of these young gamers who feel like they've always their interests have been marginalized within the school context. So when we did research with NASEF, it was clear that they were the fact that they were sponsoring a competitive esports team in the school, that folks would show up and watch the tournaments and the athletes would be celebrated, really resulted in an identity shift for a lot of young men who felt like their interests were not recognized or within the school context. And that had a lot of spillover effects in just their attendance and engagement within the school context. The other design elements are shared practices and shared purpose, which is just really that you're doing things together that are meaningful in a social way. And gaming is fantastic that way because it already has that competitive structure and that recognition structure and the social engagement built into why kids are playing and engaging in the first place. And then the last principle is really the one that I've been talking about already, is that ideally, it doesn't remain just in a little silo of competitive gameplay. So NASEF, for example, and esports in general, it's not just the kids who are competing, but it's the shoutcasters, it's the marketers, it's the communication skills. And NASEF has built a CTE curriculum that is around sort of the business side of esports that sits within the high school curriculum alongside a club that involves young people in all of these activities, as well as the competitive play as well. So again, it's not just, kids narrowly pursuing one little interest, but really starting to connect those interests into other skills, connections, relationships that can matter for them in other parts of their lives. And I'll close just one last example. I've been talking a lot about like fandoms and gaming and popular culture interests, but I just want to highlight that what motivates young people is really diverse. So this is an equity-oriented framework. Sponsorship means meeting young people in where their interests and identities lie. And a lot of young people, especially given a lot of the movements around climate and social justice and anti-racist approaches, that civic engagement and community uplift is one of the big motivating interest areas. And we have a lot of tools and resources around connected civics. So looking at civic engagement as a site of interest-driven learning is, I think, incredibly powerful. And I'll just give a little plug to a report we did around various action civics approaches that are starting to take root in schools that we think are really powerful examples of the connected learning model. Here's, a lot of more case studies and resources are on the Connected Learning Alliance site and the Connected Learning Lab. I know we're going to move into breakout rooms, so I wanted to close with just a personal example to tee up one of the prompts that we're hoping you'll engage in to start at the breakout room, which is really just, a lot of, I think, connected learning is happening in small places in our everyday lives. When you think about yourself, how you decide to pursue an interest, whether it's a hobby or something that's related to your career in a socially supported way, what does that look like? And I'll share just an example from my childhood. It's often very small things that make a really big difference. You don't have to adopt a whole new action civics model for your school or like remake a school based on game-based pedagogy. It's often those small connections like what Maria experienced that really have a big impact on young people, even though it's a relatively light lift for the educators. So I have an example from fourth grade where when I was a kid, I was like a nerdy kid who just loved to read all the time. It was my primary interest. And Mr. Schwartz, I still remember his name in fourth grade, he just, had one term decided to, ask us to sort of write down the books we were reading and share with him the books we were reading out of school. And it was the first time like I really felt seen and heard. Like my brother and I were the only Asian kids in our whole elementary school. And even to this day, just that small act of him taking an interest in what I was reading and engaging in at home, it's like one of the only things I remember from my elementary school days, quite frankly, with such vividness. So a little connected learning goes a long way, and I'll end there.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed your conversations. I certainly enjoyed the two that I was able to be a part of. We're going to bring Dr. Ito back onto the stage now to answer a few questions. So, Dr. Ito, I'd love to start with a question that actually came into the chat during your presentation. Someone asked, are there certain schools that are embracing connected learning? And are any schools of education using connected learning with their work with pre-service educators?
Yes, I think that was Lucy's question, and we got to chat a little bit in breakout.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, I put a link to one certificate program I know about around connected learning, but I also, we were chatting about how, it could be hard for schools to holistically embrace connected learning because it's not really like a school model. It's sort of a model of schools connecting with other spaces. So we found that it's actually the libraries, teen services in libraries that have fully embraced the connected learning model as part of their strategic plan. So the YALSA, Young Adult Library Services Association, has like fully adopted connected learning because it's an interest-driven institution in a way that, schools support interest-driven stuff, but have to do a lot of other things too. So what we're finding is that it's not so much that, I mean, there are schools like the Quest to Learn schools in New York that, are kind of a full connected learning model school. But I think the way that most schools have been adopted connected learning is through certain kind of interest specific programmatic approaches like, the esports program I described, or action civics, or student voice and leadership, or STEAM and STEM and makerspace type programs. So it's not necessarily like connected learning as an umbrella, but we have all these partners who are developing these programs that connect in school and out of school learning around different interest areas. And as a connected learning community, we try to elevate that these are all of certain, embodying a certain set of design principles, but because it's so variable depending on the interests of the students and the population, and frankly, the interests of the educators in school, that it's harder to think of it as like a whole school model or framework that can be easily kind of applied across different school settings.
Got it. Thank you for that. The next set of questions kind of centers around how the pandemic, if the pandemic has impacted or changed connected learning. And some of the follow-up questions there were, because of the shift to online learning, are students more apt to connect online around their interests, or have you seen technology fatigue with young people? What are you and your team seeing specifically in the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because during the pandemic, there was a lot of, surveys and things happening. And I think there were I think a lot of young people had negative experiences with the sort of formal instruction during the pandemic. Obviously, it was very variable, but there were, as we reopened, there's kind of this rush to go back to normal rather than carry forward positive innovations in online learning, because I think overall people felt like it wasn't as good as in-person learning. And the narrative has been that from an equity perspective, we have to move kids back into in person quickly. Now, I think the problem with that is that when we looked at all the survey data about the pandemic, it was clear that a lot of young people wanted to continue working learning from home or in hybrid contexts. And it skewed towards young people who, it wasn't just like, okay, only the rich kids were getting good stuff or being online. A lot of the students of color who felt sort of the oppressiveness of certain kinds of policies, or felt like they were There were tensions with the school context, felt safer and more comfortable working from home, doing school from home. And so there was definitely a skew towards students of color preferring online learning, neurodiverse kids finding that there were certain learning approaches that work better for them. And so I think it's really unfortunate from an equity perspective that the narrative around equity has been, we got to get everybody back, rather than really thinking at specific groups, needs, and subpopulations, and what forms of online support and learning could really help them thrive and carrying those learnings forward. So I don't, and I'm curious because you all are the experts and school leaders, if there are pockets of innovation there that where that is happening, but we have, found that is relatively few and far between. Tacoma is an interesting school district that we've talked to where they did take their virtual schooling model and really expand it during the pandemic. And they have not only sort of online formal curriculum, but online enrichment. And then they said, well, we're an online school, but so why don't we serve the entire state? Like they started to really think of things that were different and innovative. I think that's one example. But I think overall virtual schools, even though they were in theory set up to kind of take the helm of this new innovative space with pandemic, I think they have continued to be underpowered and not supported as things have reopened. The other thing is I've been hoping that there would be a bit of a mind shift in grown-ups sort of not being as judgmental about young people's gaming and social media and recognizing that they're authentic sites of social connection because they were absolute lifelines during the pandemic. And we were talking about that a little bit in our breakout group. And it seems like, that whole sort of screens are bad across the board thing maybe hasn't changed much either, even though you would think that recognition might have shifted. And I'll just say one last thing. You contrast that to what's happening with workers, where people aren't going back to the office every day a week, like, because we are empowered to say, look, I want to work from home 3 days a week or 4 days a week or 2 days a week. And we haven't given our kids that option. And that is just pure sort of power differentials and what young people are able to ask for, and we as grown-ups are.
Yes, I thank you for that comment. Well, I think we have time for one last question. And so thinking about school leaders, I know we have a lot of curriculum developers on the line. What are the supports that teachers might benefit from in becoming more comfortable and more confident with, letting go a little bit and not being the expert in the room and embracing these connected learning experiences? What types of supports might they benefit from that school leaders and curriculum developers could be thinking about?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear from all of you on that one because you all are the experts. I don't know if that's something I'm able to ask folks to chime in on, what kind of supports or barriers are in place for these kinds of for adopting these kinds of approaches, because I am not the person that's working within the school systems.
Got it. I know we had some great conversation in one of the breakout rooms that I was in, where we talked about helping teachers to be comfortable being a little bit uncomfortable. Justice shared with our group, helping teachers to see the bigger picture, that these experiences might not always result in rigid and absolute learning goals. And that a part of this also relates to more experience and more training with culturally relevant teaching. And that all of these pieces come together. So that was something that Justice shared with our group. And I just want to, publicly thank Justice for sharing that.
I think that it's absolutely aligned to the movement towards culturally sustaining approach. Sorry, was somebody jumping in?
I think Justice was jumping in there.
Yeah, I was just saying, Stephanie, thanking Stephanie that she summarized it very accurately. But I think that COVID has placed such strains on like our teacher workforce, that we're trying to get teachers into the classroom sooner, faster. And faster doesn't always mean better. Teachers are like, you have to cook them, they have to learn certain things. They have to understand the premise of certain things. And so like when we're talking about these like unique ways to teach, like that has to be taught. And so to me, it points to a need for quality teacher preparation programs, teacher quality partnerships between universities, so they're getting like full-time benefits, and just going back to schools to contribute back to that culturally relevant pedagogy that that we've been talking about.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much for that.
yeah. I think that's absolutely right. It's just that the space to really take the time to connect with students and, with shared interests, culture, identity, all those things are so important. And, one thing that I have heard from educators is that sometimes like this whole idea of connected learning feels really overwhelming because it just is so different and it's not what teachers are often valued for, or sort of like the outcomes take longer to play out and they're not like measurable and like the concrete, you know, stuff that gets measured in school. So I really just like to underscore that, it may seem like so trivial from a teacher's point of view to just open for them to share some of the things they're interested in outside of school, but it really does make a huge difference when educators do that. It's really just, it's hard to, yeah, it's, so I think like it's like teaching calculus is hard. Saying, asking a kid how their day is and what they're doing, what game they're playing is not. But, often the easy thing and the small thing, because of who an educator is in young people's lives, it's just very, very powerful.
Well, I can't thank you enough for today's session. This has been really a fabulous hour together. We've learned so much and have so much more to think about. So for our next steps, I encourage you all, when we publish the blog, which should be within the next week or so, that summarizes today's discussions, please take a look at that. We also do have 2 remaining sessions in this series, so we encourage you to attend those. I know we're dropping some links in the chat now. For joining those sessions, we'd love to hear from you about how today's session was for you. And then we also want to share one additional opportunity with you. Our Center for Inclusive Innovation is hosting a series of learning salons. We will share the link to that in the chat as well for you to check out if you are interested in continuing the conversation with a broader organization at Digital Promise. So again, Dr. Ito, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone being here, and everyone have a great day.